welcome to the Big Five podcast from Northumbria Psychology Department. My name is Dr. Genevieve Brown, and I'll be your guide into the minds of psychology students, alumni, and researchers at Northumbria University. I'm a lecturer and researcher in the psychology department, and I study social psychology. Each week on this podcast, I'll speak to a guest who is either a student, alumni, or researcher in the Northumbria Psychology Department. By asking them 5 big questions, we'll learn about their time studying psychology and hopefully learn some big facts about human behavior and experience. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking to my guest, Professor Pam Briggs. Hello, Pam.
Hi there.
Pam's work focuses on security and computer-mediated communication, and she is currently the Northumbria University Director of the Center for Digital Citizens and leads on the Safe Citizens research theme. Tomorrow is Computer Security Day, so Pam, I wanted to ask you about what your research can teach us about how people engage with cybersecurity. So just to start with, how did you become interested in this topic, and what are some of the theories behind your research in this area?
Okay, so I guess as a psychologist, I became interested the minute it became clear that cybersecurity was a behavioral issue. And I guess this tracks back to 1999, where a quite famous paper called Users Are Not the Enemy came out. Before then, the whole thing about cybersecurity was that it was something that was considered a technical issue. So we could protect ourselves through technical means, getting the right software in place, doing the right kinds of scans. And really, humans were the pests in the system. They were annoying, and everybody working in cybersecurity was a technical person, with computer expertise. But this Users Are Not the Enemy paper talked about the importance of not blaming the user and saying, basically, if you've got unworkable cybersecurity policies that are asking users to do unreasonable things, bearing in mind that cybersecurity is not their day job, they have other jobs to do. So because this paper was saying you can't blame the user, you've got to look at those policies, you've got to look at yourselves, it became clear that psychology had a role to play in thinking about how we could make things better. And luckily, I've been doing some work before then in e-health, where I was looking at behavior change models in e-health, and I was looking at things like, how do people, when they go online, decide whether to trust information and advice that they get. So there were some threads in that really were relevant to the new world of cybersecurity when it became clear it was a human-centered issue. So we started to see a whole trend there for human-centered cybersecurity, and I've been really involved since the start of that. So you asked about what kind of models and theories that we bring to it. There's a whole range, really. I guess the first set of theories were all about usability, because human-computer interaction has been going as a discipline, has been going for a long time now, and it all started about, is this system usable? Can people comprehend it? Do they have the skills and competencies? Is it designed simply? And I know that for many people these days, when they pick up something like an iPhone, everything's designed to be simple and slick. But, you go back before that famous paper, 1999, I said it came out. You go back before then, and systems were often pretty difficult to use. So there was a whole set of theories about how to make things more usable that were kicking around. And so a lot of work was looking at unusable policies, incomprehensible policies, user competence and being able to work in a cybersecurity area. But more interesting for me, I think, were the behavior change models that came into play. I don't know if any of your authors have read Susan Mickey's book on behavior change, but there are over 80, or at the time she wrote it, there were over 80 behavior change models. So there are plenty to choose from in psychology. A model that we've worked a lot with is protection motivation theory. So again, this has come from health, and I guess the best example I could give, in current times perhaps is to think about COVID, because when you think about how motivated you are to change behavior, or even something like how motivated you are to get vaccinated, you've got to think about the threat and how severe that threat is. And there's no doubt COVID seems like a pretty severe threat. You've got to think about how vulnerable you are to that threat. So, if you're an older adult with health issues, chronic health issues, then you're going to be more concerned. So those threat things will mean that you're likely to want to change your behavior and want to protect yourself. And then you've got to think about the kind of coping side of things. So do you have the resources available to be able to protect yourself? In this case, one of those resources might be a vaccine. Another resource might simply be a mask. So you might have those resources available, but do you trust that those resources are going to be effective? So if you don't really believe that masks are going to be effective, then you might be less willing to change behavior and wear that mask. And then there are a whole host of these sort of coping factors that sit together with those threat factors that can predict whether or not you're going to take some action. So that was the example from health, but a lot of people now, and we certainly have used protection motivation theory in the cybersecurity literature and in our approach to doing research on cybersecurity. So again, we look at how people understand the threat, whether they feel that they are vulnerable to the threat, and quite a lot of people don't. So you take something like a phishing email. People know that they get phishing emails. I don't know if all the listeners will know what phishing emails are, but they're the kind of scam emails that pretend that they come from, say, Apple or your bank, but they're not. They're really fake emails designed to get you to take some action that means that your system could be attacked. So something like a phishing email, a lot of people think, oh yeah, well, nobody would be interested in little old me, so I'm really a target for a cyber attack. It's the bigger organizations that are targets. So people don't necessarily feel as vulnerable as they might. So that's on the threat side. And then on the coping side, again, with cybersecurity, a lot of people feel that, oh, I just won't have the technical skills. I won't know how to protect myself. When protecting can be something simple, like, having a strong password. But at the same time, sometimes people think, oh, well, I couldn't possibly remember really complex, long passwords. So, you get into this loop about people feeling that they haven't got the competence and then thinking, oh, well, probably I'm not going to be a target anyway. So you can see quite a lot of interesting behavioral issues start to come into play there.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting that you use health models in this work, and we talk about computer viruses at Health Term and how they spread from computer to computer. So I think that's quite an interesting link. So you're talking about the behaviors that we can promote for people to protect themselves online. What kind of methodologies do you study to get at these behaviors, to understand how users understand their systems and what kind of risk they might be at?
Yeah. That's interesting to me because there's such a wide range of different methodologies that you can use in this space. When I started in psychology, my PhD was on word recognition and reading and dyslexia, and I was a real experimental psychologist, a cognitive psychologist. So I would typically, use methods with a kind of factorial design where you had a control condition and you compared it to performance in various experimental conditions. And that kind of thing still goes on in cybersecurity. So I've just been talking about phishing, for instance. And it is possible when you're doing research on phishing that you might set it up that you're trying to lure your participant in a study to see if they will click on phishing emails. And you might have emails that you've designed in different sorts of ways. So you might have, conditions where you've made the emails seem like they're more from their social network and they're more informal, from friends kind of thing. And you could compare whether or not they're more likely to click on those from emails when they seem more official, for instance. I mean, that's a very simple example, but we've done a number of studies in relation to phishing to see whether, you know, social lures are effective. And we've set those up as experimental designs, but also we've used signal detection theory, which is an interesting measure in psychology, which is to do with your ability to detect a signal against a background of noise. And in this case, the signal would be the fake email, the phishing email, against a background of noise, which would be just the general kind of emails that you're getting. So, you know, that's obviously, it's, you know, an experimental method using quantitative methods, using a very particular kind of analysis. Signal detection calculates your sensitivity to a particular signal and bias that in responding to that signal. I don't want to go too much into that, but it's you know, it's a really nice methodology. So we've used things like that. But if I then contrast that with you know, the kind of qualitative work or work that we might do within organizations. So, you know, we sometimes talk about doing research in the wild, which means, you know, getting outside of the laboratory where that phishing study might have taken place and going into an organization. And if we think about that, we've done some interesting organizational work around the way in which employees feel that they should protect themselves and what their priorities are in protecting themselves. And that's a mixed methods approach. So we developed this task that we called the cyber survival task. And it's based on something that people may have heard of called the desert survival task, or sometimes they talk about the NASA moon landing task. And these have been used in organizational psychology and decision making for quite a while. And in this task, what you do is you ask people to rank order protective measures. Now, in the desert survival task, what you do is say, oh, you've landed in a desert, you crash landed, here are 20 objects that you've got available. Could you rank order them? And it could be, you know, like a plastic bottle, where presumably if you find any water, you could collect it, or a knife, you know, they're just these objects that might be useful to you. Could you rank order these objects in order of importance? And you get your participants to rank order them, and then you also get your a set of experts to rank order them, and you see how those rankings compare. And we developed this as a cybersecurity task where we had groups of people from different sectors within an organization. So if we take a university, you know, you might get a group of administrators, you might get a group of, say, PhD students, you might get a group of lecturers working together, that they would rank order what they thought the best protective measures were. So we'd give them a series of measures like use strong passwords, update regularly, etc., and start with 20 of those. Get individuals to rank order them, and then you can have a group discussion around the most important and least important. But for us, the most interesting thing when those groups talked was collecting the qualitative data about why they felt certain things were important and that they should take those actions, and why they felt that things were maybe less important and they didn't need to do it. So quite often in these group discussions, people would say things like, well, that's not really my responsibility, so I don't think it's important that I do that. And so, for instance, you know, updating, they'd say, surely, you know, it's down to the technicians, the IT department in this organization, that they should arrange for updating to happen. So it's not my responsibility. So I'll rank it quite low down. Whereas something like, oh, use a strong password, yeah, they might then say, oh yeah, I could see that that's my responsibility and it's something I could do something about. So we did this study, and one of the interesting things is that if you then get these sort of rankings, you can compare your experts, your cybersecurity experts within an organization, the people who are kind of the team who set up cybersecurity in the organization. You can compare their rankings to the rankings of everyday users, the employees, and it gives you a very quick visualization of in terms of how well they're calibrated. And it's food for thought for the IT people, but you can then turn that qualitative work into something that you can say, well, this is why you're getting this differential. You can look at where the big gaps are between the different rankings, where they're poorly calibrated. And you can then have the qualitative research and the thematic data that helps understand why they're poorly calibrated at that point. And we found that the IT experts found it really useful because they were saying, oh, I hadn't really got into the heads of the users and understood why it's, why they're not doing what we're asking them to do in these policies. So I found that quite an interesting way to do the work.
Yeah, that's so interesting. It's a very human approach to studying technology, actually, asking people, what is your experience of this? And how do you feel about it? Why is it difficult? And kind of bridging the gap between the technicians and the users. That's great. What was the most, maybe not necessarily about that study, it can be about any research you've done in this area, but what's the most interesting or surprising thing you found about how people interact with cybersecurity?
I think the thing that came to me late, and really it's only something over the last 2 or 3 years, particularly working with someone called Ben Morrison, who was my PhD student and is now working at Northumbria as an innovation fellow. We were doing some work together on older adults, and it became clear how emotional a topic this was. Because it's not the kind of topic that people think, oh, that's going to be fascinating, cybersecurity. And for a lot of people, it's just not a very interesting sounding topic. It just sounds like it's dry and it's one of those things you just have to do, and there's not going to be a lot of interesting stuff in the research. But actually, when we've done quite a lot of work at Northumbria with older adults. We're kind of known for that work, I think. And older adults have an awful lot of cybersecurity challenges. But one of the things when we were doing interviews about the way they managed their cybersecurity, particularly post-retirement, where they no longer had a place of employment where they were getting advice and regular updates about how to manage their systems. Post-retirement, older adults will often, have spend time online, but actually, as I said, it was the kind of emotionality, because there was a lot of shame associated with cybersecurity. That older adults were saying, I really don't want to engage because I don't know what I'm doing. I haven't the foggiest about why I'm vulnerable. I don't know what to do to protect myself. And also, I don't have the language to be able to ask somebody for help. So, that lack of competence was a real source of shame and also a source of great stress. So, I mean, one of the things in Ben's PhD that he was doing was trying to develop, use some stress models to try and understand how people come to cope with cybersecurity problems, and using things like the transactional model of stress, which of course pretty much says the worst situation you can be in is when there's a real threat out there, but you don't have the resources or the knowledge to be able to cope with that threat. So under those circumstances, you might then stick your head in the sand, and start to do more kind of, well, your coping strategy would not be effective. So you get stressful, but you get into some kind of a denial mode. And so I suppose, I've really been quite surprised about how emotive a subject it is, given that on the surface, as I said, it seems like a really dry topic to be involved with. And we're certainly starting to look into that kind of thing in a bit more detail. And I think older adults are an interesting community in that regard, because partly because of the diversities of older adults. Often people will sort of say, oh yeah, older adults, and you've got some kind of typical older person in mind. But I've already said, some people have a lot of resources financially, some people don't. Some people have a lot of social resources, a great social network. They might have a large family with young kids who are very, kind of geeky minded and are able to help them. Other people live alone, might not have that kind of social network. So that whole thing about coping ties in with how many resources people have in their ability to cope, and I think it's an interesting new development for us.
Yeah, I think that is very interesting. I mean, older adults using technology, it's not something they grew up with, so it's a skill they're having to learn at an older age.
Yeah,
So just that in itself is quite interesting. And then to hear about all the emotions that provokes when somebody doesn't feel like they're competent in something, but they're confronted with it every day because our society is so digital now.
yeah,
Yeah, that's super interesting. I can't wait
yeah.
to see what other research comes out of that.
And actually, just to add to that, because older adults are increasingly targeted now, so they're becoming one of the biggest targets. I mean, they've been targeted with things like romance scams for years,
Mhm.
where they can be vulnerable. Often older adults, those who do retire with a financial package, they're ripe for the plucking, if you see what I mean. And so they've always been a target in that sense. But actually, there's a whole new set of problems that they're facing now. And just one example is that only last year there was a change in government policy so that older adults had to pay for their television license in the UK. So it was the case that older adults used to get the television license free. And actually, TV licenses are one of the biggest areas for scamming and for phishing, because you get a lot of emails saying, oh, you need to pay your TV license. This is how you pay it. Click on this link. And so it's become a real problem, because actually, we've got groups of people who haven't paid for a TV license, so they could be in their 70s and they haven't paid for a TV license, for many years. And suddenly they've got to pay and they don't really know how to do it. And they're getting emails to say, oh, it's simple, click on this link. And you can see the kind of problems that come up.
Yeah, especially with TV licenses are an interesting case because it's the government that requires you to pay, but then they go through a separate company to actually charge you for your TV license. So I can see how that would be difficult to tease apart. Is this a real thing I need to pay, or is this a scam?
Yeah.
Yeah, super interesting.
We were actually in a meeting with these various organisations, and making that same point. But to be fair, they were on the case. They realised that the emails were going to have to come from a really clear source, and if you're getting emails from kind of some obscure company that older adults aren't likely to recognise, then it's going to be a bit of a problem. So,
It's good. I guess we've already talked about this a bit, but what kind of impact do you think this research has in people's lives? Do you see how your research has been able to influence people in how they do cybersecurity? And do you have any examples of that?
yeah, so we have deliberately tried to make sure that our research results and data um, influence both government policy around cybersecurity and government actions, and also influence business where that's appropriate. Um, so, for example, I guess this is picking up on that meeting around the TV license, but wherever we see a possibility that we think, oh, we could get involved and influence what's happening here, we will take that opportunity. So if I talk about the government stuff first, a number of years ago, there used to be a nudge unit in the government. They called it the nudge unit. So, I was saying earlier about behavior change.
Mhm.
And the government had got hold of this idea that behavioral economics, behavior change methodologies are the way forward. And in the Cabinet Office, they developed this nudge unit to try and think of ways to influence citizens to behave, to behave in ways that were generally good for them and good for the nation. Since then, it's become a spin out, this unit, but when it was still there, we were invited to write up a government paper that would influence policy in relation to what kinds of behavior change models were out there that could influence people's secure behaviors. And that started a relationship with various government departments that has continued. We've often presented at the Home Office, for instance, and presented around their Cyber Aware website, which was, at that time, it was held by the Home Office, and they were trying to promote better cyber behaviours across the UK. Since then, the last few years, there's been the National Cybersecurity Centre set up, the NCSC, and that was kind of a bit of an arm of GCHQ. But now the National Cybersecurity Centre does a lot of work with academics. Northumbria is recognised as one of 19 academic centres of excellence in the UK in cybersecurity. So, you know, we have a forum where we can communicate results to government, and we continue to try and work with them, influencing these campaigns that they set out. So the campaigns recently in the NCSC, they were talking about what they called U-shaped security. U is in YOU rather than the letter. So, you know, making security something that you understand and is fit for purpose and is relevant for you. And we've been having a lot of discussions with them about that campaign and trying to influence the messages that get out. So that's one way we try and have impact. Another way, as I said, is with business. And so, for example, we've worked with cybersecurity companies that develop training, corporate training in cybersecurity. Now, this is a really interesting and quite controversial topic because everybody hates mandatory corporate training.
Yes.
You know, if you have a day at work where you think, oh, I've got to spend an hour or more doing corporate training, then it can be a real pain. And we've been working with a company called Think Cyber recently, who, you know, we're trying to do something about that. So we had an Innovate UK grant, which allows universities to work directly with companies to try and develop something that would be more palatable for employees. And Think Cyber had already developed their own system called Red Flags that they'd rolled out, which was sort of little bite-sized pieces of cybersecurity knowledge being, rather than sit down, you know, you have a really lengthy corporate video to watch. And we did some interesting work there. We were talking about methodology earlier. Here, I guess we should say we were using something called speculative co-design. So what we're doing was working with employees of different companies, where we'd sit down and have workshops with them, trying to design, you know, some imagined future of corporate training where it was all perfect, and you know they would get more excited about it. It would be something that could be fun to do, etc. And we talked about things like, oh well, you know, if we gamified it, would you like leaderboards, you know, so you can see how you're doing? And then of course some people said, oh, that'd be great, and other people said, no, I would hate to be, you know, have my performance on a leaderboard. So getting involved with the participants themselves, you know, the end users, is a really good thing to do in this space. So yeah, we did some redesign there, and that company has now rolled out a new product that seems to be working well. And just one final thing, I guess, on impact is that we are also sometimes we work more directly with community. A colleague, James Nicholson, took some work that we'd been doing with University of the Third Age and developed a kind of training package for what he called cyber guardians within the older adult community. So training up people who could then train their peers within cybersecurity. So it became more accessible, less fearful of a thing, um, and that, you know, it's not a technical thing so much as just making sure you get people involved with other people and rolling it out through their social network, and that seems to have worked very well.
Excellent. Wow, that's a lot of interesting projects that you've been able to work with and influence. One last question. No, I might have actually a cheeky sixth question afterwards, but where do you hope to go from here in your research? Where do you see this field moving in the future? Do you think it'll continue with this human side of cybersecurity? Are there new challenges that you see that need particularly to be addressed?
So some of the latest thinking we've been doing is again drawn from health, which, as you said earlier, you know, there are a lot of parallels, so it's been quite interesting for us. We've been doing some work around cyber resilience, and I think resilience is an interesting concept because, you know, again, drawing from the health literature, it relates to the kinds of resources that you might have, you know, including your social network. So, you know, if you're trying to um, recover in a health context, you know, you actually need to have a decent social network around you to help. And during, I used the COVID analogy earlier. During COVID, it really was interesting that you had to rely on people to get shopping in and things like that. You know,
Mhm.
so that social network's important. So there are those kinds of things, but also one key thing about resilience is how you respond to adversity.
Mm.
So resilience is always about bouncing back from an adverse event. And I think that bouncing back is a lot to do with your, you know, what I was talking about earlier, this sort of stress and coping and more of the emotional thing. Do you stick your head in the sand? Or do you then start to think, oh, I could learn from what's just happened and make sure it doesn't happen again? Um, so, you know, things like what did you learn if you had some adverse cybersecurity incident, or do you feel like, you know, it just made you want to, you know, step away from it and
Mm.
ignore it. You couldn't really cope with it. So resilience and coping is something that we're definitely looking at. And I think the other thing is that which is incidentally, it's kind of it's interesting because it's COVID related. I was using COVID as an analogy, but this is COVID related, but directly, you know, related to cybersecurity. Since people have come out of the COVID lockdown, they've had to use technology much more than they did before. So, you know, you've got apps that are in restaurants to even see the menu, whereas before you were given a menu. You've got, um, you know, to pay, you now have to pay. I mean, we're moving into a cashless society. So, you know, very few people are paying with cash anymore. And then often you would pay via these apps. Each time you're signing on, you know, you're going to a restaurant and, oh, I've got to log in, I've got to create a new profile, I've got to create an account. All of these are points of vulnerability within a
Mhm.
digital system. So I guess that's the other thing that we've started to look at is, you know, are we prepared for this new world that we've re-entered? And again, picking up on things like older adults, you know, they may be more vulnerable than others when it comes to, or not all of them, as I said, I don't like to lump all older adults together, but some older adults will be more vulnerable.
Yeah, even things like your vaccine proof now you can get on your NHS app on your phone. So that's also another security risk to think about. That's really
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah, definitely.
Okay, a cheeky sixth question. What are some concrete recommendations you can give to our listeners about cybersecurity and some actions that they can take to protect themselves personally?
So earlier I mentioned the National Cybersecurity Centre. And they have a website where they give a lot of very good advice on that website. So I would direct listeners to the NCSC. One of the things they did a couple of years ago is roll out a new policy around passwords. So recognizing that passwords had become a little bit extreme, they rolled out this idea of 3 random words in a password. It's tricky because some sites will force a number and a character, etc. But 3 random words is now considered to be a very good password because it is A, more memorable, and that is a bit of a problem in passwords, and B, relatively easy to generate. If no one has ever seen how quickly passwords can be cracked that aren't good passwords, it is shocking. I mean, we're talking less than a second for many passwords to be cracked, because there are these things called dictionary attacks. I mean, to throw a whole dictionary at a password takes less than a second. We're really we're not talking very long. So I think people have to understand that you can't just think, oh well, the name of my first pet is going to be a successful password. And yet it is surprising how many people still have 1234 or their name just with a 1 after it, or these kinds of things. So I guess that's probably the best advice I can give. Both make sure you use good passwords.
All right. Well, I will include that in the podcast notes for anybody who wants to go see those. Thank you so much for talking with us today, Pam. This has all been so interesting. Where can people find you online and find out more about your research?
So I don't think there are many other Pam Briggses. I think there is an author. But generally, if you Google me, you'd find my Northumbria page would come up pretty quickly. And then in Northumbria, we always have links to our publications that come up on that author page, so people can find both my email and the links just by Googling Pam Briggs.
All right, and I'll include your Northumbria researcher page on the show notes as well. If you'd like to learn more about Northumbria psychology, check out our psychology department blog at northumbriapsy.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at northumbriapsy. If you want, you can follow me on Twitter at browngenevieve, and I'll keep you updated on all our new episodes. If you'd like to be interviewed on the podcast or know someone who would, please email me at genavee.brown@northumbria.ac.uk. Finally, if you liked the podcast, make sure to subscribe to our podcast on your listening app and give us a review and rating. I hope you've learned something on this voyage into the mind. Take care until next time.